What are the most common signs and symptoms of sexual addiction in men, and how can they be addressed? This and other questions related, we will be asking our special guest today. First of all, my name is Dipchand Ramcharitar. I'm the Outreach and Development Coordinator at Voice of Men 360. Voice of Men 360 is a nonprofit organization based in London, Ontario, Canada, founded in 2020 and was born out of seeing a tremendous need and stepping up to provide services to help, support, and overcome men and boys' life challenges. We are part of International Men's Day. They have been serving for over 21 years and in over 90 countries, joined together doing various activities regularly in the interest of men and boys. They follow 6 pillars, which we align with here at Voice of Men 360. Before I introduce our special guest today, I would like to go through our disclaimer. We would like to remind you that Voice of Men 360's mission is always delivered with good faith towards peaceful harmony. The views and opinions expressed in today's episode are those of our speakers and do not necessarily represent Voice of Men 360. Our organization engages in discussion forums to offer inspiration and create awareness of the issues of men who wish to overcome their life challenges. We are not providing medical or therapeutic advice. Should you require that type of assistance, we recommend you contact a medical professional immediately. If you have any questions or concerns about today's episode or any Voice of Men 360 content, please email us at info@voiceofmen360.org. Now, on with the show today, we have, as I said, a very special guest, Peter Eilers. He's a licensed professional counselor and life coach. He has been a therapist since 2016, and from last year, he started a practice that specializes in sexual addiction recovery. Welcome to the program, Patrick. And first of all, you would introduce yourself and tell us what inspired you towards the path of life coach and counselor.
Yeah, thanks, Dipchand. Thanks for having me on tonight. Absolutely. I'd like to introduce myself, and my name is Patrick Eilers. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Michigan in the United States. I'm also a professional life coach, as Dipchand mentioned. I just started my business in 2024, moving more into the mental health wellness coaching realm. Have worked for the previous 4 years for a sexual addiction recovery program with the previous practice I've been part of, and so some things I've done there. I've also worked as a general practitioner before that, kind of working with a lot of different age ranges and diagnosis and those kind of things in that realm there. So those are some things I've done in that sense. So I've had a lot of different experiences. Kind of what led me into being a therapist really started back really when I was back in high school. Started really around that age, probably about 17, 18 years old. I started realizing that, I had a lot of people come up to me and talk with me and talk about relationships, talk about struggles that they had, and just kind of realized that, I had a pretty good talent for listening. And so really enjoyed being able to kind of help people sort of piece things together when they wanted to kind of process stuff and whatnot. So don't have a huge interest, or never really had a huge interest in the science of psychology, so to speak. I think people work in a lot of different ways, but I've always had an interest in wanting to help people improve their lives. And so one of the things that inspired me was very early on in my life, I saw basically a video that shows people's lives being changed and identifying through like a giant card. If you think about it, they were holding these giant cards on stage, and the identities were things that they had used to be in their life. So addict would be one of them, or, depression might be another one, or anxiety might be another one. And then they flipped the cards into this new area of their life, a new identity that they identified with. And so that always really resonated with me and sort of stuck with me in my life. And so that's really kind of what started me down that journey of wanting to be a therapist and going down that path. And so as I've gone through the journey, it's been something that I've seen a lot of lives change. I've seen people improve. And sometimes you go through the process for yourself. You see incremental little things for the, in your own experience with working with folks. But then at the same time, you actually see their life when kind of come full circle. So you do see people be healed, and that's always an encouraging thing. So that's kind of where I started getting involved in that. And it's been something that I've stuck with, and I do still feel very passionately about wanting to see people's lives be changed. And, last 4 years, specifically working with men, I've seen, their lives, start to improve their, where their sexual sobriety is and improving in that area in their life. And that's an area that's affecting a lot of different people in a lot of ways right now in our culture. So that's sort of kind of where I came from and sort of my background and some perspective I have.
Absolutely. That must be both encouraging and gratifying to be able to assist others in such a critical and crucial area of their life. Speaking of which, based on your experience in the last year, what are the most common signs and symptoms of sexual addictions in men, and how can they be addressed?
Yeah, so sex addiction in men specifically, I mean, that's kind of the main population that people would think about when they're thinking about sex addiction, and what does that mean and what does that look like? And so there's a very common, I would say, sort of 10, may think about 10 symptomologies. That's kind of what I would call them, that we would typically look for folks. Specifically with sex addiction, it seems like one of the things that's difficult or different about it than maybe like a substance is that, we're sort of inundated with it, and we are sexual creatures, sexual beings. So sex addiction is usually a little more aligned, similar to like a food addiction. It's a product called process addiction. So specifically, some things you might look for with sex addiction is that, the one big thing I guess I'd think of is, it seems to be something that people think a lot about, more than what other people would. And one of the things, of denial that usually comes up with that is people will say, well, I'm just a sexual being, or, I have a higher sex drive than somebody else, or whatever the case might be. So that's one symptom I guess we look for. Another one we might think about is, how often do they, what's an elevation of their behavior? So, a lot of times when it comes like with alcoholic or drug, those kind of things, those substances, you need more of that particular substance in order to have the same effect as you had the first time.
Right.
And sex addiction tends to work a little bit like that in the sense of time, like how much time you're spending with it. So a person who may say, well, I watch 5 minutes of porn a day, may start to watch 15, 20, an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, just keeps kind of going up. The other sort of way that elevates is typically what they used to watch. So something where you might say, well, I used to watch this thing that I used to have interest in. Now that doesn't really excite me anymore. I'm kind of moving to something where maybe I wouldn't have normally been excited about that before. So that's certainly something else to look for in that sense. Another particular substance or sort of way they would think about it is, what's their history with their family? A lot of people who struggle with sex addiction have come from a family background or family dynamic that has been what we call rigid in their thinking relating to sex. So that means that, sometimes it can be the family's not open about sex, meaning that they can talk about everything else but sex. That's one area. Sometimes it's people who, feel like sex is shameful. That's certainly another area that comes up a lot. So those are some different things that, family of origin can certainly play a role there. One's belief system and who they are, how do they see themselves? How do they see themselves in the world? Do they feel like they're unacceptable? Very common belief system we see is looking at the idea that I'm just unlovable. Like my belief system is that I'm just not a lovable person. And so that definitely can play a role in trying to seek those behaviors that are going to kind of numb that out or make that feel more, make me feel less of that way, less of that belief system in that sense. So those are not always easy to sort of piece apart. There's about 10 of them we'd look for as far as like diagnostics are concerned, but those are a few common ones that people would probably be able to see in their life or see in their experiences.
Okay, I believe you just touched on it briefly about the shame aspect. So, sticking to that, what role does shame and stigma play in preventing men from seeking help for sex addiction, and how can we work to reduce these barriers?
Yeah, shame is huge. We see it all the time. Something is when people are struggling with their sexual health and sexual sobriety. Shame tends to perpetuate itself. So usually a lot of times, there's a very close association between shame and guilt. And shame is usually I am the thing that is, the problem, when guilt is a little more of I've done something, that's caused the problem. And people have a hard time sort of breaking that down. So shame plays a large role in why people won't go and get help or get assistance in that sense. I think the other thing, when you talk about stigma, the biggest one I would say is that people just don't think sex addiction is something that's real. Or if they do, they don't think it's related to them specifically. The reason I say that is because a lot of the folks I've worked with in the past would originally start coming in mainly because of the relationship that they're in. The relationship's been affected by their behavior, whether it be an affair, whether it be using pornography behind their wife's back or their partner's back. Different behaviors like that specifically usually lead to them wanting, there's distress in the relationship, so that's why they seek help. From an addiction perspective, it can be something that's going on throughout all their life. And many times people will say, well, later on, they kind of realized that they had something going on. They just didn't know what to do with it. So I think there's certainly a shame piece of the inability to control it. There's that aspect. And then the stigma of, this really isn't something I should be really concerned with because everybody else does it. It's a very common denial we hear a lot, right? This is very common, but nobody talks about it, kind of thing. So those are kind of the two big ones I'd probably say you see the most. I think part of that breaking down is, number one, you're addressing it head on. Like, this is something that does happen for people. It is something that's very common for folks. It's not something that, only one or two people deal with. It's something that, especially it's on the rise because of social media, dating, some of those kind of things that go on in our society right now. But then on top of that, you also add in the fact that, there's this idea just of mental health, wellness is something that people don't necessarily think a lot about, right? They only really want to work on themselves when they can't, or they feel like they can't navigate any more than what they've been able to so far, when the symptomology gets, unhealthy enough, I guess is a way of putting it. And so when you see that, people that's when they tend to seek help. So I think helping mental health being something that is more of this is something we all struggle with, we all deal with, and we have to navigate that as it is, right? Not something as, it's not something you're not less of a person because you're struggling with something mentally. Everyone goes through stuff like this. So I think kind of normalizing it in that way is always a really good way of kind of helping break that stigma. That's a way I've utilized it throughout all my career, has been to try and normalize it for people that, they're not alone in what they go through and what they've experienced. So I'd say those are probably some big things to think about when it comes to stigma and those areas.
How much do you think it would help if the public is made more aware that this is actually an addiction? So instead of pointing fingers, it would help if you become more aware and empathetic towards one of the addicts. This isn't about condoning actions. This is about looking for a more effective way to address the problem.
Well, yeah, I think certainly society, there is a belief that, that this isn't an issue. Like I said, kind of there's that overall belief that this is something that isn't, how do you become addicted to sex kind of thing. And again, it also depends on what we define as being healthy. That's another thing that's changed a lot as well. The person who, just because the person wants to have sex with their wife or their partner, but if they want to have sex with them 10 times a day, it's probably unhealthy for the relationship. So it's also trying to define what is really healthy for people and what is appropriate for people. I know we kind of have, so just society wise, there's a real barrier, kind of 18 and up is sort of that's the barrier that most of the time people consider. But really there's a lot of unhealthy behaviors beyond just sort of the legal, illegal kind of conversation. I mean, there certainly is that as well, but there's more things beyond that. And a lot of that comes from the idea of just, what are we doing? What are people doing sort of in private? That's the other thing, is that there's a secret life. So from an addiction perspective, just like anything else, are people as a society, we're addressing the secrecy of things, because again, that goes back to vulnerability. And so there's some things with vulnerability, like, are people really being vulnerable in their relationships, in the society, having conversations that really are authentic? Or are they just coming from a perspective of, hey, I do things in the side that nobody knows about, and that's okay. That's where people, I think, usually their perspectives are typically coming from. So there's a private versus sort of secret is a way you kind of get to think about in that way. So there is certainly that aspect. So how do we address that as a society? That's a big part of it, I think, when you're talking about normalizing those behaviors. And like you said, being able to help people have awareness that it's not about, you've done something wrong or that you've caused yourself to become an addict. It's more of, what led you to these things, and how do you get yourself to a healthier place in that sense.
Right. Okay, that absolutely makes sense. So shifting gears a bit here, how can life coaching and mentoring support young men in overcoming apathy and develop a sense of purpose in life?
To me, I think apathy can overcome in three ways. The first way is identifying your identity, or kind of knowing who you are. The second is understanding emotional intelligence, and then being able to communicate that. A lot of times therapists and coaches really kind of assist in developing these areas for folks, helping them understand their identity, helping them understand their emotional intelligence, and helping them understand how to communicate that. from a perspective of, when things are not being fulfilled in life, and you see this with sex addiction a lot as well, that when we're not fulfilled, we're going to fill that void, so to speak, with something. So when you think about your purpose or your vision in your life, those things have to be very clearly defined. Particularly when it comes to, we see this with working with addiction, is that, one of the things is identifying your vision. It's kind of, if you ever heard of a 3-circle sobriety plan, you kind of have it looks like a target. You have an inner circle of behaviors I'm not going to do anymore. You have a second circle of behaviors that you're going to, places you're going to avoid or situations you're going to avoid that lead you to those inner behaviors. And then that third circle is really where you're going to go, your vision of your life. Another analogy I use is like a cable car. From like the bottom of the mountain to the top of the mountain, there's a cable attaches you from the bottom of the floor of the ground all the way up to the top of the mountain. The top of the mountain is your vision. Where do you want to get to? And so that looks different for everybody. And so having a clear picture of what that looks like, being able to close your eyes and being able to see yourself in that vision plays a huge role of being able to get to that point of where you want to go in your life. I think when we lack that, that purpose, we lack that identity, sort of in our life, we tend to sort of, like I said, we fill it with things that are unhealthy. Simon Sinek, who's a really good, he wrote this book called Start With Why. And one of his exercises he talks about doing is, if you want to know your why, is to talk about, for the friend, why are you friends? Why are you friends with me? What about me makes sense that you're for friends? And so they're going to go things about roles and the things that you do in the relationship. And then when they really get to talk to you about why they're friends with you, that's kind of your why, and that's your purpose. And so you kind of get a clarity of that. And so a lot of times, life coaches and therapists particularly, there's a little bit different perspective of how we each look at that. Therapists tend to look sort of the past, how did your roadmap lead you to where you're at, and how do you move forward from there? Right. Life coaches look more at kind of where you're at now and how do you move forward with that and developing that purpose. So I think apathy really is affected by the one's inability to be able to work on those 3 areas in their life. And so if you don't know yourself, you don't know what you're feeling, you're experiencing, and you can't communicate that, it's going to feel very empty. And so you're going to try to fill that with a lot of things that are going to make you numb out and make you feel something. That's another thing. Addiction typically feels a lot of times like that as well. Like there's a part where I'm not feeling a whole lot of anything, so I'm just trying to feel something. And that's sometimes another reason why people struggle with sexual addiction or sexual compulsive behavior.
Right. Now, I understand that these days, especially younger people, do their dating through dating apps, and they decide on not necessarily a life partner, but at least choosing someone for a date based on profile. Yep. It was different, maybe 10, 15 years ago. So I think it's important that this be addressed. How can life coaching support men to develop meaningful offline connections with others, and in cultivating healthy communication skills in their relationships?
Yeah, when I was thinking about this question, relating to it back to just, unplugging from the world, certainly the idea that, that dating is something that's become an online consumerist type approach, right? So we're dating based on the first image of whatever you get from the profile. And so really trying to move toward more of an authentic. And I think that really comes from, I mentioned vulnerability earlier. Communication specifically for men typically is, men don't really necessarily know what they're experiencing. Sometimes they struggle to verbalize what they're feeling, what they're, what's going kind of on internally. So that's part of it is self-awareness. From that perspective is that you kind of learn more about how to bring some of those things to the surface. So life coach, therapist, whoever you work with, the idea is to try to help bring awareness to circumstances and situations. So specifically, let's, we'll use the dating example. If I go on a date and I'm telling, too much information on myself, or maybe I'm sharing some things that are going to be, too deep there, or maybe I'm not engaging enough with the person. I can bring that back to therapy. I can bring that back to the life coach and kind of work through a little bit of that, kind of review it. Like if you think about with a sports team, when you get good at certain plays, you have to review those particular plays that you're good at, also the ones that you're not so good at. So you have to kind of do the same thing with a therapist or life coach can help you to work on that area. I think specifically with the communication, you can find ways to reword things, find ways to be more communicative about yourself. Journaling is a pretty big one, I would say as well. Like learning to journal also helps you to be able to bring a lot of that stuff to the surface, either whether it be in the therapy or whether it be individually, and then allows you to be able to be more self-aware. kind of back to what I was saying, this previous question was, the identity and self-awareness and emotional intelligence kind of comes from a place of continual introspection, or what they call metacognition. So you're thinking about your thoughts and thinking about how you're behaving and thinking about how you're acting and those kind of things. So I think a lot of those kind of things those are definitely areas that a therapist or a life coach can help and support, can certainly help you explore those areas and kind of get to a deeper level of those, because a lot of times that's really where, I think men particularly struggle with that, and as far as being able to bring those things to the surface.
Yeah, well, then the other thing too is men are generally falling behind in other areas, like education, jobs. It obviously affects their ability to have relationships. And so, what strategies can be employed to address the vulnerability among men, including an anger toward society, such as school shootings? We have these shootings. They said some of the contention is that these are done by who are called incels. That's a controversial area, and also towards suicidal tendencies.
Yeah, when I think about vulnerability, Brene Brown says vulnerability is a choice, and so a lot of times when we're kind of sort of in nature, emotional safety, I think, is a big part of what people are searching for, as far as the ability to be able to be more open. Now, that's not necessarily a strategy. But a strategy from the perspective of, are we creating emotional spaces for people, and specifically for men? Kind of going back to the idea of societal anger, is that, typically anger, at least in my experience, comes from not things that necessarily that I'm angry towards, things I'm afraid of, right? I'm much more likely to be angry at something that I'm going to be curious about, the thing that scares me. And so a lot of the times, anger plays a pretty big role in my fear. And I think fear comes from an idea of not being able to understand or feeling misunderstood. Certainly that area, I think, when you talk about isolated people who are away from others, they tend to sort of hyperfixate on that. You see this a lot with, talking about sex addiction. You see this with people who are struggling with addiction. The addiction pulls them away from the people they care about, and that gives more and more the idea that people really don't care about them, reinforces sort of their own unhealthy behavior or belief system. So I think when it comes to, the lack of curiosity is really a big part of trying to seek that out for people who are struggling with that area, especially if they're angry toward a specific group of people or whatnot. Are they really looking at it from a curiosity perspective? Are they giving opportunities to have an emotional safety perspective to work and talk through some of those things? So I think strategies would be involving, creating more environments for men, particularly, and really human beings in general, to try to be able to talk more through or feel more safe in that way, emotionally. And a lot of times in a lot of these circumstances, we don't, because online has given us an ability to be able to be disconnected from either the consequences or, in some ways, the reactions of other people. So we can be keyboard warriors all day long and share all of the things that we want to share about in life, and never see the reactions of people in real time. So I think when you're talking about kind of getting into that, an additional piece to it, as well as also understanding that, are we doing a good job of listening? A lot of people who are usually hurting, or they're angry about something, they're usually telling us about it in certain ways. Are we listening? Are we spending a lot of time kind of just focusing on telling people how they should do things? Or, if I'm the person that's angry and responding in that way, am I doing enough listening myself? So I think listening plays a pretty big role, as well as curiosity in the process of being able to create those emotional safe spaces,
Right.
in realms of what, whether it be in school, whether it be in community organizations, church, those kind of things. Are people doing a lot of listening? It feels like there's not as much listening as there is people sharing their opinion versus the listening component.
Right. So a continuation of that last point you made, what community-based initiatives can be developed to promote men's mental health awareness and provide support for those in need, for example, mentorship programs, sports team, and community centers?
Yeah, so there's some good, great collaborators out there currently. I can think of. One is a gentleman named Daniel Hearn. One of his podcasts is called Hard Knocks Talks. It's also based in Canada. He's a really good resource as far as just the one I can think of off the top of my head is kind of like the community creating one. They connect a lot with the different resources, and I think they're in Regina. So they do a good job of kind of connecting with other resources for folks who are looking for mental health and struggling in that area. In the States, we have an organization called NAMI, which does a lot of educational perspectives as well. They kind of are a community organization as well. You can think about, I think for a lot of people, when you're talking about resources connecting therapists to other community resources, it gets a little more tricky because of the pay scale, pay structure, especially in the United States. A lot of people want to use their insurance, and then there are private pay people that are available. But again, there's a kind of a balance to that. What does it look like that's affordable for the clinician as well as the client? So those are some areas that certainly are tough to necessarily see, but I'd say like consistent connection there. But I do think that the one thing is, do people really believe that they can improve? I think that's one of the things that hampers people from improving is, do they believe that they can improve? And then do they also feel like they are going to maximize their time there? I think one thing about therapy is that it doesn't necessarily feel like it has a start or end date. Sometimes it feels like for people, they want to start and they just kind of keep going. It's can we work with the client to improve, and then also does that also change other people's lives because they continue to improve themselves? And then the last part is being able to have rapport with people. I think that's the other thing as well, and that does come from places like community centers and sports teams and different types of community organizations. A lot of it is rapport based, type of connecting with people, mainly because if you don't have a lot of good rapport with people, you're not going to have people who are going to feel, go back to emotional safety. You're not going to feel safe to be participating in those groups. So I do think there's an avenue of that, of where do we kind of help people build that rapport and have those safe spaces. And again, that does come from some community centers. It does come from podcasts. It does come from clinicians. There's a lot of different places where some of that can come from. It just feels like it's very kind of broken apart. There's not like a way that's all brought together. That seems like that's one of the areas that we're missing.
Absolutely. Do you see a growing need to develop policies that address the unique needs of men and boys, such as increased funding for men's mental health, and prostate cancer as two examples?
Yeah, I think mental health for men and just health in general. I mean, there's been a slow, gradual, at least in the United States anyway. I feel like especially physical health, there's been a slow, gradual sort of awareness being made, but
Right.
certainly still not close to what could be. Again, people not taking it seriously, people not thinking it's something that's that big of a deal. I think men are very easy to brush it off.
Yeah.
So that's one area for sure that happens with the physical health, but the mental health too. Mental health, particularly for guys, it seems like one of the biggest struggles is that they can always overcome it. That they can do it isolated. They can do it by themselves. They don't want to look at the pain. They don't want to experience the things that they've dealt with before in the past. They just kind of keep wanting to go forward from it. And so that can really be a hampering from the idea of wanting to help, because you could be available to help, but if people aren't willing to step into that, that's
Right.
going to be really challenging. So awareness is part of it. I think there's definitely a need for continued awareness in that area. But I think the other part of that as well is helping men to understand really what is mental health treatment look like. I think, so again, we kind of talked about earlier, what is a therapist versus a life coach? What is sex addiction treatment, for example, versus, kind of a general practitioner approach? What are those things? Talking about, different psychology type of perspectives like cognitive behavioral therapy, or, what they call EMDR, so some different types of, therapies that are out there. I think part of that might help people be understanding a little more what they're looking for, what might meet their needs, and also be able to help them in a more effective way. So part of it is, yes, absolutely, the knowledge that they're going to gain, but also that this is something, we kind of talked about earlier, normalizing it, that this is something that everybody goes through. And so that, people being able to pick that specific therapy for them that's going to fit, what they, and again, being okay that the first time is not going to may not be immediately successful.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of people who, start therapy and never go back because they had unfortunately, they've had a very ugly experience with that. And so part of it also is, helping people understand therapists are people too, and we're not perfect. We don't always do things right. So there's a lot of that too, that, can we be humble enough as well to help people, men particularly, in the sense that, first time does not mean that's going to be the same experience you're going to have over and over and over again. And that gets tricky sometimes because people have had some really ugly therapy experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. There's obviously a lot of ground to cover to make up for this sad lack of awareness and funding. And I'm sure there are other areas, as you said, therapy is another one. So lots to accomplish and to get on the ball there with. Another area of um, grave concern, and I'll do a little sort of an introduction to this question. Granted, men and guardians have an obligation and responsibility towards the upbringing of their children. The reality is there are far too many homes without their input for sustained periods of time, some of which is beyond their control, resulting in severe and lasting repercussions. How can we effectively bridge this crucial gap?
Yeah, then that comes back to the first initial I thought I had is that it comes back to relationships, and post relationships, especially relationships that don't. My understanding is if there's children in the home, there's probably going to be a relationship that's coming to at least minimally there's going to be a break in the relationship. I think that's something that we've seen it because of like things like the divorce rate going up. It's kind of become more normal that people come from a split home or a home that has a two-parent household or separated parents in that way. So I think that when you're talking about that kind of area, part of it is the bridging of the gap is being able to have advocacy for men as well as women on both sides for both parents to be able to do more co-parenting. And co-parenting is an area that can be really tricky because if it comes from a perspective of the relationship versus sort of the children or the parenting, that's a little bit of a perspective change. So again, therapists can work with that and help with that. Again, I'm not a parenting expert by any means, so certainly wouldn't have too much insight on that idea. But that's the first thing I thought of is that co-parenting is really about bringing both parents together and being able to in unison work together in the family. If you're not able to do that, then yeah, you're going to have exactly what you just described. You're going to have one-sided, one or the other be kind of the total dominant perspective, and that does have a lasting effect on a lot of the children. So part of it is, I think there's some laws in there as well. I mean, I don't have a great understanding of parental laws and in divorce in that sense that way either. But certainly when there is at least in the United States, at least there can be custody that's only given to one parent or the other for various different reasons. And so then is there anybody advocating for the other parent in that sense? If it's the men in the sense, like are they advocating for the men to be continued in the child's life? And I think it's also coming down to age as well. There's certainly, if you're a child who's younger, it's going to have a greater effect. I mean, not that it wouldn't have a similar effect maybe to an older child, but it might look a little different there just because the child's in a different developmental stage. So I think there's some things with that in that area that could, as far as actually bridging the gap. I mean, number one, I think it's advocacy again for men in that sense. And then the other side of it probably is being able to understand that it is important for both parents to have some type of role in the child's life. And if they're not in their life, then it's gonna have grave effect on the child. And how does the effect of children and their upbringing in the home, how does that domino affect everything else, right, that goes on in the society? So that's another big part of it, I think, and that goes all the way back to kind of what we started was that, sex addiction is something that, ends up ruining a lot of relationships and consequently does have a lot of effect on the family, especially if the relationship has children in it. So that's something that I guess I'd say, I think it does. There's a lot more consequences than what we necessarily immediately think of.
Yeah, there are lots of different facets to this problem. It is a growing concern. It is a huge concern, mostly throughout the Western civilization. So it's something that absolutely needs to be addressed, and the sooner the better. We have pretty much run out of time. I have one final question for you, but before I do, I just want to offer a bit more information about our organization. There are no limitations to gender, age, nationality, or ethnic groups. All walks of life can participate in any of our shows. If you want to be a guest on any of our shows or willing to be part of our organization and help us directly or indirectly, please reach out to us. We would like to work with professionals, individuals, experts, community organizations, associations, corporations, government officials, and businesses. Our phone number is 226-289-8784. Email address info@voiceofmen360.org. Website is www.voiceofmen360.org. And you can also find us on pretty much all social media. We also have a Facebook group page. Please join our group so you can see our daily activities and, of course, invite your friends as well. Other social media platforms we're on would be Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Voice of Men 360. So, Patrick, our final question for you is, can you share some contact details about the work you do?
Absolutely. So, yes. So the best way to get in contact with me is through our business website, not website, email. Business email is bloomworks, BLOOM works, CC @gmx.com. And so that is the direct email for our business. If you'd like to get in touch with me or you're interested in more business services, you can follow us on LinkedIn. So Patrick Eilers, MALPC. I think I have a clinical supervisor on there, and then Bloomworks CC is Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching is the name of the business. So you can find us on there. We do have a YouTube channel. I do weekly journal segments about journaling and kind of those. That's what we're starting with right now, and so that's at Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching. It's on YouTube. You can also find us at Patreon. So a Patreon channel. It's patreon.com/Bloomworks. And you can also find us there as well. And so we have a lot of connections there. I put all the podcasts of it on those kind of things on the Patreon channel. So definitely check us out there.
Absolutely. So we've come to the end of our show, and we would like to thank Patrick Eilers, who is a licensed professional counselor and life coach in Michigan, United States. And this has certainly been an informative and absorbing information session, very meaningful, and hopefully we all have learned some important lessons that we can apply to ourselves and our fellow neighbors, friends, family, whatever out there. So again, thank you so much, Patrick. It's been a pleasure having you on. And to all of you out there, we want to say thanks a lot for joining us today. Thanks again, and goodbye from us here at Voice of Men 360.